In the previous seminars, we talked about evidence-based practice. Now we talk about how these evidence-based, how this evidence can be used as consumable product. Those will be guidelines and consensus statements. Clinical guidelines are now commonly available for a number of conditions. They have become familiar because there is a large amount of data or large amount of possible recommendations or possible options that you can do for management and for diagnosis, and hence it is necessary to sift through this increasingly large impenetrable information, and hence clinical guidelines have become necessary. They influence decisions at the bedside, because when you have a patient at the bedside, you are not going to be able to read through the current evidence. So clinical guidelines would be a good resource to go to. Tells you which diagnostic or screening tests are the most sensitive or the most specific, as the case may be. It tells you rules of operation at hospitals and clinics. It talks about what is their optimum length of stay, and it also tells governments and third-party payers how much money they should allocate for certain conditions. So clinical practice guidelines can be called statements that include recommendations that are intended to optimize patient care. These are informed by good high-level evidence, and it is an assessment of the benefits and harms of alternative care options. So if the best is not possible, then what are the options available? Now, what all healthcare systems around the world are facing: increasing healthcare costs, increasing demand for care. With the onset of internet, patients often know a lot about what their problems are and options that are available. There are more expensive technologies, and there is an aging population. So geriatric medicine requires a plethora, may have a plethora of conditions, and so you need to know exactly how to deal with them. Another possible reason is, this we already talked about, variations in service delivery. Each person or each hospital does a different thing, and then there can be inappropriate care, there can be lawsuits, there might be overuse or underuse of services. So we need some sort of guideline. An intrinsic desire of healthcare professionals to offer and for patients to receive the best possible care. So sometimes we may go overboard in our interest in giving the best service possible. Guidelines translate the best evidence into best practice. The best evidence is research evidence. How are you going to put this into practice? How are you going to use this evidence in order to treat your patients on a day-to-day basis? That is what guidelines help you do. A well-crafted guideline will help in reducing healthcare variations. So if you have a guideline that an association, let us say the MCI, says that these are the guidelines that we will undertake, and these will be revised after 2 years, then by and large most doctors in India would be held accountable to follow those guidelines. So it will decrease healthcare variations. It will improve diagnostic accuracy, likewise, promote effective treatments and therapy, and discourage ineffective or potentially harmful interventions. So guidelines can be seen as a tool for making care more consistent, efficient, and closing the gap between what clinicians do and what they read about. An old Chinese proverb says there are many paths to the top of the same mountain, but the view is always the same. Now, there can be many guidelines. Okay, so the guidelines are can be made by different groups. So if they all follow more or less the same if they follow more or less the same methodology, or if they are using more or less the same databases, what is the end product is going to be the same. Guidelines are important when wide regional variations exist, and similarly, if wide variability in guideline methodology then it mandates a systematic approach to guideline development, which is the reason we are going to go through what are the necessary steps of a guideline development. Good guidelines are quality driven, they are evidence based, they are efficient, they have a transparent methodology, they are multidisciplinary. If these 5 aspects are taken care of, then you have quality driven, evidence based guidelines using efficient and transparent methodology for action ready recommendations with multidisciplinary applicability. So if you are talking about stroke, it should talk about hello? Speaking? Yes. So quality guidelines are characterized by the following attributes. They produce quality-driven, evidence-based guidelines using efficient and transparent methodology for action-ready recommendations with multidisciplinary applicability. So if you have a guideline on stroke care, it will talk about what the neurologist must do, what the nurse must do, what the physiotherapist or the occupational therapist or the speech therapist must do. It's going to talk about the entire spectrum of care. So it will have a multidisciplinary applicability. The processes that are involved in a guideline development are, first of all, you need to convene a running guideline development group. You need to identify and refine the subject area. You need to assess evidence identified by systematic literature review, translate evidence into recommendations, and you subject the guideline to an external review. So you need a group. You need a group of people who are interested in this topic and who are experts in this area, who will form the core group. You need to identify and refine the subject area. What aspects of stroke care do you want to consider? Do you want to talk medical management or do you want to consider all management? Then you need to, based on that, you will have your systematic review objectives or your systematic review questions. And then you will assess the evidence via literature review. Once the scientific evidence is clear, then you need to transfer this into recommendations. What are you going to do? That is level 1 evidence and no evidence of harm. So this is something that you must know. There is level 2 evidence and some evidence of harm. So this is something that you may not necessarily do, and so on. At the end of it, you need to give it to another group of people for an external review, just like you would do any other document. So this is basically an overview of the stages. You have planning, you have literature review, you need to have conference call or a meeting. You need to have a literature search, conference call again, or a meeting, in-person meeting at least once, now. Literature search, you need to write assignments, what each person in the core group is going to do. You need to have an in-person meeting again. You need to write assignments to revise and polish the draft guideline. Appraise the draft guideline implementability. Is this going to be possible in your setup? You have a conference call again. You need a pre-release peer review. An external group will look at the draft guideline and give recommendations. And this target audience must be people who are actually practicing. And you need an organizational board review and finally publication. So when you plan, convene and run a guideline convening and running guideline development groups, you need to identify the topic so that you can identify people who are interested or who are experts in this area. Then you identify who is going to be the organization leader, who are going to have clinical leadership. So organization leader is going to be the one who is going to administer the whole clinical guideline making. You need clinical leadership for people who are actually going to do the work. Identify partner organizations, guideline working group members, compile grid, determine dates for conference calls and meetings so that people have a deadline. Topic. There can be conditions, procedures, signs and symptoms. It may be depending on a condition like stroke. It could be procedure. It could be totally replacement, irrespective of the reason. It could be signs and symptoms, cough. It could be topics can be selected which are high priority in the healthcare spectrum, and then you need to set your priority. What are the things you are looking at? Are you looking at the epidemiology, disease burden? Are you looking at cost of care? Are you looking at evidence, whether people are following the evidence or not? Potential impact, public provider interest, variations in care, or how this will be translated. The group should consist of at least a chair and 2 assistant chairs. There should be a staff lead, an assistant, technical consultant, content experts, stakeholders, and consumer representative. So these are the basic organization leadership, which I'm not going to go into great detail. The clinical leadership will encourage members to contribute to discussions and activities, summarize main points, and delegate the writing part. Partner organizations are recruited as necessary for certain aspects. So if it is talking about stroke, now you might require therapists for small parts of the guideline. You might require a social worker for some part of the guideline, and so on. These would be the partner organizations or additional specialty. You may require someone from medical records to talk about documentation and so on. Working group members will be individuals from a single discipline working on one particular aspect of the guideline. So, individuals from a single discipline sometimes are biased towards procedures because they have done it for a long time. So, these must be balanced by having people from other places in order to decrease the bias. This is not very important. Conflict of interest can include employment, consultancy, stock ownership, honoraria. It can be because you are getting traffic grant or you are getting a gift from a pharmaceutical company, so you tend to be biased. These are things you need to disclose. This is just administration. Now, what is the role of evidence in guideline development? Identifying evidence is the most essential component of guideline development. Everything else is administration. So, the most important thing to check is the ratio of benefit to harm and cost. And if the level of evidence is very high, and there is a big gap between the highest level of evidence and the next one, then cost may not be a high priority. But if the gap between the two, the highest level and the second level is not so, then you may have to consider costs also as an important aspect of the recommendation. They recommended if there is no evidence, if there is research gap, recommendations are still possible, but it can only tell you that the level of evidence is low, so the strength of the recommendation becomes less. So you have recommendations graded as A, B, C, and so on. So if there is an evidence gap and there is no high quality systematic reviews or meta-analysis to offer for that particular topic, then the strength of evidence may fall. And if the strength of evidence falls, then the recommendations will also fall. Identifying evidence is by literature review, through systematic reviews, randomized control trials, supplementary literature, and so on, and other types of studies. Prior to starting out on this guideline formation, you must have minimum quality criteria. A priori, you must decide what level of evidence are you going to even consider for your recommendation. So there must be an a priori hypothesis driven protocol. So you need to write down, plan out exactly what you would like to do. If there is no evidence from RCTs, then we are not going to give any recommendation. So this would be an a priori hypothesis driven protocol. And the systematic literature search must be explicit and it must be clearly defined. Validated data extraction from source articles. So that must also be all the included, excluded articles, everything must be given in the references, so that you know whether the guideline has been actually derived from high quality evidence. Data pooling must be done with standard statistical techniques. Tabular presentation of results with graphical summaries must be given. So statistics must be done and the results must be well represented. All systematic reviews that will go into forming a guideline must be conducted using a priori protocols following quorum, Moore's statement, etc. Some of the other evidence databases are Cochrane Collaboration, AHRQ, Medline, CINAHL, Clinical Evidence, BMJ, and so on. National clearance, all of these are databases. What would be the requirement for calling? The first conference call sets the stage for guideline development by introducing working group members so that you build a team, defining the timetable and scope. And the call must be recorded so that you know exactly what you discussed. These are all what you would do in the first conference call. Stage 2 is literature search. So the individual working group members must identify the RCTs and assess quality. Then comes the second conference call, where you will review the first conference call and timeline and see if you have adhered to it, if you have adhered to the goals that were set, and whether the working group has adhered to their assignments and deadlines. So you will review and you will plan for the first in-person meeting. So these are the things that you will do in the second conference call. In the in-person meeting, you must each working group will present the work done and review the presentations, modify if needed, rank topics and assign evidence. So now if you have stroke and you have 7 working groups, so there must be a consensus on what are the topics that must be most that the guideline must be most devoted to, and what are the sections that can be that can have less representation. So these things must be decided in an in-person meeting. These are some of the other things that you will do. What was the mean rank? How did the working group members rank each of these areas, and what was the mean rank? Based on that will be your recommendation. So now, poor athletic performance and fatigue. The mean rank is 7. So that would be high. So you might give higher recommendation for that. In the in-person meeting, you are going to make key action statements. And from this, you will, so you are saying diagnosis of exercise-induced asthma. It's a writing assignment. So primary staff, secondary staff and the reviewer. 3 people are going to be looking at this. Stage 3 is literature review again, focusing on the best published evidence to facilitate the writing tasks for each of the action statements. So one action statement was physical activity in children with asthma. Then you would try to get the best published evidence through the PICO framework. The chair and assistant chairs will collate the writing assignments and make the first draft. So you have grade A evidence, well-designed aggregate qualities, well-designed randomized control trials or diagnostic studies. Comment will be randomized trials should have valid randomization scheme. So all of this you are doing through the quality rating. B will be RCTs or diagnostic studies with minor limitations or highly consistent evidence from observational studies. Again, quality rating. For key guideline statements, if you have A level, then you say strong recommendation. B and C will be recommendation, D will be option, no recommendation, or if A, B and C do not exist, you may want to give recommendation. Second in-person meeting, the members will review the draft guideline, give research and implementation needs, assign profiles and appraise the implementability. Next will be ensuring the implementability. Now this is a working group of experts who have sat down and read literature, and from their discussions they have made a draft guideline. Whether this is actually going to be implementable needs to be tested before you publish the guideline. And then after it is published, you must decide when will the update be required. How often will the guideline need to be updated, or parts of the guideline need to be updated. So this is how a guideline must be made. So now our point here is how to appraise. When you appraise a guideline or a consensus statement, now a consensus statement and guideline are used interchangeably. The terms are used interchangeably. The appraisal guidelines, the easiest tool is AGREE. Now you have a second version called AGREE 2. Appraisal of Guidelines Research and Evaluation Instrument. It is a widely used generic measure of guideline quality. It looks at explicit scope and purpose of the guidelines, stakeholder involvement, who are all involved. So if you have a very small group of people who have made a guideline or a consensus statement, then it would mean that the recommendations are very narrow, that it does not necessarily apply to a large audience. You want to look at the rigor of development, the steps that I just went through. Clarity of presentation, is it understandable, is it applicable, and was there editorial independence? Was there a conflict of interest between the editor and the and the working group? So these are things that you need to look at, that the AGREE tool will tell you. Now, guidelines are never intended to supersede professional judgment. Guidelines give you guidelines. They tell you what can be done. And then sometimes an individual clinician may not be able to follow those guidelines under the particular circumstance. That is not a problem. It tells you by and large how you must act in a certain condition. Guidelines are different from systematic reviews and evidence reports, because systematic reviews and evidence reports are talking about research methodology and how to reduce bias. But they are not talking about patient values or available resources. So a guideline uses information from evidence. It uses the best best research evidence, and then puts it into form of how you can use it by considering values and linking the strength of the administration to the quality of evidence. Therefore, guidelines and consensus statements from one country may not be entirely usable in another country, because patient values and resources may vary. So this is the reason that guidelines may have a little bit of country specificity. Thank you.